I've been riding a long time, seen a lot of roads and a lot of faces, but there's this one kid I still think about sometimes when the shop is quiet and the coffee's gone lukewarm in my hand. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Funny thing is, I don't even remember what job we were riding back from that day, but I remember him clear as daylight, like he's standing right in front of me even now. He was sitting on the curb outside a little grocery store, knees pulled in, watching people walk by like he was studying them for a test. Most folks looked right past him, same way people look past loose change on the sidewalk, but something about that boy made me slow my steps. Maybe it was the way he kept his back straight, even though his clothes were worn and too thin for the weather. Or maybe it was how he nodded polite at everyone who glanced his way, like he was raised proper and hadn't forgot it. I remember thinking he didn't look wild like some runaways do, didn't look angry at the world, just tired and careful, like he'd been carrying thoughts heavier than a kid should carry. My brothers were heading inside for coffee and pie, laughing about something dumb, and I was right behind them, but I stopped when I passed him because he looked up at me, not scared, not begging, just looking straight, and I swear there was more manners in that look than I see in half the grown men I meet. I asked him how he was doing, just simple like that, and he said, "I'm all right, sir," real soft and respectful, and that sir stuck with me because kids don't say that much unless someone taught them right. I remember noticing his shoes were tied neat even though they were worn at the toes, and I remember thinking a boy who still ties his shoes careful when nobody's watching ain't giving up on himself. I stood there longer than I meant to, and I could feel my club watching from the window, probably wondering why I was talking to a skinny kid instead of coming in for coffee. But I didn't mind because something in my chest said this moment mattered, even if I didn't know why yet. He didn't ask me for money, didn't ask for food, didn't ask for anything at all. And that told me more than words could, because most folks who want something lead with it. But he just sat there like he was waiting for the right person, not the first person. I asked his name, and he told me. And I won't forget that name long as I live. And when he said it, he looked me in the eye steady, same way honest men do when they shake your hand. I remember thinking right then that this kid wasn't like the others who drift through town and disappear like smoke. There was weight to him, like he carried a story he hadn't told yet, and I felt this quiet pull to listen if he ever chose to tell it. Been a lot of years since that afternoon, and I've had bigger things happen, louder things, things most people would call important, but none of them stayed with me the way that small moment did. Standing on a sidewalk with engines ticking behind me, and a quiet kid in front of me who didn't look away. I didn't know what he was about to say, or how it would turn out, or why fate put him on my path that day. I just knew my gut was telling me slow down and pay attention, and I learned a long time ago that when your gut speaks calm like that, you best listen. So I shifted my weight, folded my arms easy, and gave him the kind of nod that tells a person you got time, and that was the moment I decided to hear him out. I remember the small things about that boy clearer than I remember whole years of my life. And that might sound strange to some folks, but it makes sense to me because small things are where truth usually lives if you take the time to notice them. After I gave him that nod, he didn't rush his words like someone trying to sell a story. He just rested his hands together and looked down a second, like he was lining his thoughts up nice and straight before letting them out. And I recall thinking that was a careful habit, not a careless one. Most kids his age talk fast when they're nervous, but he talked slow and plain, and every sentence sounded like he picked it on purpose, which told me he respected words and didn't want to waste them. I noticed how he listened too, really listened, the kind where his eyes stayed on mine, and he gave a tiny nod when I spoke, not interrupting, not drifting, just steady. And I remember thinking that kind of attention is something even grown men struggle with. My brothers were still inside the diner window behind me, joking and tapping mugs, but that boy never once looked past me toward them or toward the road or toward anything else that might pull his focus. And it crossed my mind that he must have learned early that when someone gives you a moment, you treat it like it matters. His hands were clean even though his sleeves were worn, and that stuck with me because it meant he'd found a sink somewhere and took the time, which told me he still cared about how he carried himself. I remember he thanked me every time I said something, even when all I did was ask a simple question. And that kind of politeness don't come from nowhere. It comes from someone raising you with patience once upon a time. And I found myself wondering who taught him that and where they were now. He didn't complain about anything, didn't blame anyone, didn't try to make me feel sorry for him. And I'll tell you plain, that's rare because most people, grown or young, when life gets hard, they want you to feel the weight of it right away. But this kid carried his quiet like it was his own responsibility. I also remember the way he paused before answering certain things, not like he was making something up, but like he was checking inside himself for the honest version. And that right there is when my mind started settling on the idea that he wasn't spinning a tale. I've met liars before, plenty of them, and they usually rush or decorate their words. But this boy kept everything simple, like a straight road with no curves, and that kind of straightness is hard to fake. One detail I still see clear is how he shifted a little so an older lady could pass on the sidewalk without stepping off the curb. And he gave her a small, polite nod, even though she didn't look at him at all. And I remember thinking kindness that nobody sees is the real kind, the kind that tells you who a person is when there's nothing to gain. The sun was hitting the pavement just right, warm but not hot, and I can still picture the light catching the side of his face while he spoke, calm and steady. And I thought to myself that life hadn't hardened him yet, not the way it does some people. And I felt glad about that in a quiet way I didn't say out loud. I asked him where he'd been staying, and he answered plain, not proud, not ashamed, just honest. And I could hear in his tone that he wasn't asking for rescue, just understanding, and that made me respect him more than he probably knew. Time seemed slower in that moment, like the world gave us a little pocket of stillness to talk in, and I found myself paying attention to every small thing he did, the way he breathed steady, the way he waited his turn, the way he said thank you like it mattered every time, and all those tiny pieces added up inside my mind until they formed one clear thought I trusted. Something told me this kid was telling the truth. I can still see the moment he finally told me what was really on his mind. And it comes back to me slow and clear like an old song you ain't heard in years, but somehow still know every note to. Because that was the minute I understood why he'd been sitting there watching folks instead of calling out to them. He leaned a little closer, not sudden, just careful, and his voice dropped softer like he didn't want his words floating around where they didn't belong. And I remember thinking that whatever he was about to say mattered enough to him, that he wanted it handled gentle. He said he had something to tell me, but didn't want anyone getting in trouble if it wasn't done the right way. And that right there caught my full attention, because most kids worry about themselves first, but he was worried about doing things proper. I nodded and told him he could take his time. And he did, breathing once slow before speaking again. And he explained he used to stay at a place for kids with no families, said it real respectful, like he didn't want to speak bad about anybody without reason. And he kept choosing his words careful, same as before, and I could feel in my bones he'd been holding this in for a while, waiting for someone he felt safe telling. He said some of the grown folks running that place weren't as kind when nobody was looking, not cruel in some loud storybook way, just unkind in quiet ways that leave marks you can't see. And I remember the way he looked down at his hands when he said that, like he was making sure he spoke honest and not angry. He told me he didn't want revenge and didn't want attention. He just wanted someone decent to know, so maybe things could get better for the kids still there, And I swear that's the part that settled deep in my chest, because it takes a special kind of heart to walk away from a hard place and still think about the ones you left behind. The street noise carried on around us, engines humming, doors closing, somebody laughing across the lot. But right there beside that curb, it felt quiet as a church. And I listened without interrupting because I could tell he needed someone to hear him all the way through. He didn't exaggerate, didn't point fingers wild, just shared little things he'd seen and felt, the sort of details a person don't invent unless they live them. And I remember thinking that truth has a certain sound to it, steady and plain, and his voice had that sound. When he finished, he didn't look up right away, just brushed his thumb along his knuckle like he was worried he'd said too much, and I told him he'd done right telling me that speaking up for others is never something to be sorry for. And when he finally raised his eyes, there was this small bit of relief there that I'll never forget. I thought about my own younger days then, about the times I wish somebody older had listened when I tried to say something important, and I realized maybe this was my turn to be that person for someone else. I asked him if he trusted me to handle it careful, and he gave one small nod. Nothing dramatic, just quiet belief. And that simple nod carried more weight than any promise I'd ever been asked to make. I knew right then I wasn't going to brush this off or pass it along careless, because trust like that ain't something you toss aside. It's something you hold steady in both hands. So I rested my palm on the table beside us, gave him the calmest look I had, and told him I knew someone who believed in doing things fair and proper, someone patient who checked facts before making moves. And as soon as I said it, I already had that man in mind clear as daylight. An old friend who wore a badge and believed truth ought to be handled slow and honest, so I called someone I trusted. I remember that next stretch of days like a calm season. Not rushed, not loud, just steady the way good work usually is when folks do things right. And when I called my old friend, he answered the same way he always did, even impatient, like he had all the time in the world to listen, which is one of the reasons I trusted him as much as I did. I told him I had something I want to talk about. Nothing wild, just something that needed careful eyes. And he said, "All right," in that plain voice of his that never judged before hearing a thing. And we set a time to meet. I remember sitting across from him at a small table, sunlight coming through the window, and I told him exactly what the kid had told me. No extra spice, no missing pieces, just the truth as it was given, because I believe that was the best way to respect both the boy and my friend. He didn't interrupt once, just listened with his fingers folded, nodding now and then. And when I finished, he thanked me for bringing it to him instead of trying to handle it myself, which meant something to me because it showed he knew I wanted the right outcome, not attention. He said looking into things proper takes time. And I told him time was fine because the kid hadn't asked for speed, he'd asked for care, and those are different things. Over the next weeks, I'd get small updates. Never gossip, never guesses, just steady facts he was checking one by one. And every time we spoke, I could hear that same calm in his voice, the kind that tells you a man is walking straight and not cutting corners. My club brothers asked me now and then what was going on, and I told them simple, that we were letting a good man do his job the proper way, and they all nodded because even rough-looking men understand the value of fairness when you put it plain. I remember one afternoon especially clear, sitting outside the garage with a rag in my hands, though I wasn't really cleaning anything, just thinking, and I realized I felt peaceful about the whole thing, not worried, not tense, just steady because I knew the matter was in honest hands. The boy would stop by sometimes, never pushing, never asking for news, just checking in polite. And I'd tell him things were being handled careful, and he'd give that same small nod of his trusting, and that trust made me stand a little straighter every time. My friend eventually told me he'd spoken with the right people, looked through the right papers, and followed the proper steps, so everything stayed fair and square. And he said it quiet like it was just another day's work. But I knew better I knew that kind of patience takes real character. He explained that when truth is gathered the right way, it stands strong on its own, no shouting needed. And I remember smiling because that matched exactly what I'd always believed but never put into such neat words. Nothing happened fast, and I was glad for that because fast can be messy and messy can hurt folks who don't deserve it. But this was done slow and clean, and step by step, the right people learned what they needed to learn, and things began changing the way they should have been all along. One morning, my friend met me again, same calm face, and told me it was being handled officially now, and the children that would be looked after proper from then on. And he said it like simple news, but I felt something warm settle in my chest when I heard it. Not loud pride, just quiet satisfaction, the kind of man feels when he knows something good got set in motion and nobody had to raise their voice to do it. I thanked him, shook his hand, and he told me I'd done right listening to that boy instead of brushing him off, and that meant more to me than he probably realized. Later that day, the kid came by, and I told him things were being taken care of, and he let out this small breath like he'd been holding it for weeks, and he said, "Thank you, soft and sincere." And in that moment, watching that weight lift off his young shoulders, I understood that sometimes the biggest difference you make in life starts with nothing more than stopping long enough to listen. And that day, I felt proud of all of us. I still think about that boy from time to time, usually in the quiet parts of the day when the shop settles down and the road noise fades off into the distance. And what stays with me ain't the problem he told me about, or even how it all got sorted. It's the feeling I had sitting there beside him, realizing a small moment can turn into something that lasts the rest of your life if you treat it right. Years have rolled by since then, more miles than I could count, more faces than I could name, but that afternoon sits in my memory clear and steady like it's got its own chair pulled up beside me. And I reckon that's because it taught me something simple I didn't fully understand before that day. I used to think helping meant doing big things, loud things folks could point at and talk about. But that kid showed me helping can be quiet, can be patient, can be nothing more than giving someone your time and believing them when they speak honest. I remember the last time I saw him real clear. He stood a little taller than when we first met, not because he'd grown much yet, but because he looked lighter somehow, like a weight had slipped off his shoulders. And he thanked me again, even though I told him he didn't owe me thanks. And he said he knew that. He just wanted me to know it mattered. That stuck with me. Those words, it mattered, because a lot of folks go through life wondering if what they do counts for anything. And hearing that from him felt like a quiet answer to a question I didn't even realize I'd been asking myself. My club brothers still mention him now and then when we're swapping old stories. And every time they do, there's this soft kind of respect in their voices. The kind men don't fake. And it reminds me that even tough-looking fellas carry warm memories, same as anyone else. They just don't always say it out loud. I never saw that kid again after a certain point. Life has a way of sending people down their own roads, but I never worried about him. Not really, because something told me he'd be all right, the same something that told me to listen to him in the first place, and that feeling's never steered me wrong yet. Sometimes I picture him grown now, maybe sitting across from someone younger, telling a story of his own about a day somebody stopped and paid attention. And that thought alone is enough to make me smile into my coffee. What stays strongest in my mind ain't any single word he said. It's the way he trusted me before he had any reason to, the way he chose me out of all the folks walking past. And that kind of trust is a gift whether a person realizes it or not. I've had bigger moments in my life, louder ones people might call important, but none of them feel as steady and warm as that quiet talk on the curb. Because that was the day I understood that respect don't come from how you look or what you ride or how loud your engine sounds. It comes from how you treat someone when they hand you a piece of their truth. Even now, when a stranger talks to me, I try to remember that lesson and give them my full attention. same as I gave him, because you never know when a simple conversation might be the start of something good for both of you. So if there's one thing an old writer like me can pass along, it's this: son, when someone small trusts you with something honest, you listen close and you handle it gentle. Because sometimes the finest thing a man can become in this world is someone who chose to be kind when it counted.